Slavery had been a significant problem in North America even before the United States was a recognized sovereign nation. Most enslaved Americans had to wait to be freed from the bonds of slavery by new legislation following the Civil War. Yet one man freed himself and 17 other slaves by escaping the frontiers of slavery on May 13, 1862. That remarkable enslaved man was Robert Smalls. Yet this amazing feat is not the end of his achievements. As Robert Smalls crossed many other frontiers after the Civil War, he became a leading civil rights activist and was later elected as a member of Congress to the South Carolina House of Representatives for 5 terms, becoming one of the first African American political figures in the South post-Civil War America, guiding policies in the Reconstruction era. In 1619, before the United States became a nation, European slave traders imported millions of Africans across the frontier of the Atlantic Ocean to European colonies in Central, South, and North America, and to islands in the Caribbean from Western Africa. There, the enslaved were employed to labor in mines, or more commonly on plantations, in the manufacture of sugar, rice, tobacco, and cotton. In the American southern states, in the years leading up to the Civil War, production in the tobacco and cotton industry increased by a large margin, causing the demand for slaves to grow as they were central to the entire Southern economy. On April 5, 1839, Robert Smalls was born a slave to Lydia Polite and his owner, Henry McKee, in Beaufort, South Carolina, far from the frontiers of freedom in states to the north and west. While the exact identity of his father is unknown, many theories point to Henry McKee, his owner. As a child, Robert Smalls grew up in a combined household with Henry McKee's family in Beaufort, South Carolina. He lived in a small slave cabin behind the house, but was allowed to go places and do things that others like him couldn't do. Small's childhood was unlike the harsh realities that many other slaves endured in the South at the same time. At the age of 10, Robert Small's mother hoped to inspire him to seek a future beyond the frontiers of slavery, so she sent him to a plantation where she believed he would experience the more harsh realities of slave life. He did experience more cruelty, and when he came back, he was defiant and not willing to comply. He acted like he could do what the white kids could do, which was a dangerous attitude for an enslaved person in the South. His mom was so worried that his actions would soon harm him, so at the age of 12, his mom asked Henry McKee to rent Robert out to work in Charleston. McKee agreed, with the stipulation that each week he worked he was given $1, while the rest of his wages would be sent to the McKee family. Smalls was hired as a day laborer on the waterfront of the Charleston, South Carolina harbor, working as a rigger and eventually a sailor. In 1856, at the age of 18, he met Hannah Jones, an enslaved hotel worker who had already had 2 daughters. He sought permission from her owner to get married and move in together to prevent the selling of Hannah or her daughters. Over time, Smalls would work his way up to higher-ranking jobs, starting at a port collector, then eventually he would advance to the position of pilot, although the white crew members refused to call him that. In March of 1861, right at the outbreak of the Civil War, he was hired to work as a deckhand on a supply steamship called the Planter. The Planter was used to transport cotton to other ships headed to Europe. But once the Union blockades closed the geographic and economic frontiers of shipping channels for Southern Confederate vessels, the Planter was converted into a transport vessel used in the Confederates' favor. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861 in Charleston, when the Confederate forces fired upon Fort Sumter, located at the mouth of the Charleston, South Carolina harbor, placing Robert Smalls and the citizens of Charleston at the very frontier of the war. After the official outbreak of the Civil War, the people of Charleston began building a series of forts and batteries to defend the harbor, with Smalls working on the Planter transporting supplies between the forts. This work provided Robert Smalls with the opportunity to become an expert on piloting the Planter, navigating the frontiers of the harbor, its channels, and the surrounding waters. He also acquired other critical knowledge: how to carry out Confederate hand signals, and how to gain the trust of the white crew members on the Planter. Robert Smalls believed that the situation and time was right for him to seek to escape the frontiers of slavery, not only for himself, but his family and other enslaved workers on the ship and their families. All he needed to escape was a carefully constructed plan and an opportunity. On the night of May 12, 1862, exactly 1 year and 1 month after the outbreak of the Civil War, the captain of the Planter, Captain John Ferguson, and the 2 other white men on board decided to seek much-needed rest and sleep ashore with their families in Charleston. Captain John Ferguson trusted Smalls and the black crew to be left alone in the Planter. At early dawn, around 4 a.m. on May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls released an anchor from below and made its way to the first of 5 checkpoints in Charleston Harbor, including Fort Sumter. He and the 10 black crew members on board made their way through the checkpoints, with Smalls dressed as a Confederate captain and giving the correct hand signals through all 5 checkpoints, including the final frontier of Fort Sumter at the mouth of the bay. Once outside of the Charleston harbor, he piloted the planter to a nearby wharf to pick up his family, and the families of the other crew members, then continued to the next phase of his plan. He boldly steered the boat towards the Union fleet. As he drew closer and closer, the crew on the USS Onward, a clipper ship at the frontier of the Union fleet, began readying their weapons. Now in full view of the Onward, the crew of the planter quickly took down the Confederate and South Carolina flags and hoisted a sewn-together white sheet as surrender, prompting the Onward men to lower their weapons and welcome the 17 passengers aboard. Smalls and the crew of the planter explained that they were slaves, escaping from the South, and that they would give the Union Army the planter with all the supplies that were on board, which include approximately 200 rounds of ammunition, a pivot gun, a howitzer gun, and 4 other guns. But most importantly, invaluable code books containing secret information about the signals and strategies of the Confederate side. This made the planter, Robert Smalls, and the crew the most valuable contraband seized by the Union at the time. Residents of the South were aghast and deeply angered by the actions of Smalls and the crew members of the planter, while Smalls and his crew were celebrated in the North. Congress awarded them half of the value of the planter as prize money. Afterward, Smalls became the pilot of a Union ship, the USS Crusader, and later captain of the planter. As captain of the planter, he helped secure the frontier between the Union and the Confederacy. 5 months after its famous escape on the planter, Robert Smalls described the incredible event. "I'm called to tell the story of my escape from Charleston. I do it with the greatest pleasure in the world. A hint from a shipmate led me to think about my escape. I thought so much I dreamed about it." On the Union side in New York, a ceremony was held for him at the Shiloh Church, where he was named the hero of the planter and was given a gold medal. In August of 1862, Robert Smalls and the famous abolitionist escaped former slave Frederick Douglass met with President Lincoln and Secretary of War Edward Stanton, and convinced them to order 5,000 formerly enslaved African American men to fight for the Union, breaking through another frontier for enslaved men who were previously seen as only property or contraband by the Union forces. Yet this was only the first of many frontiers that Robert Smalls crossed. He used his influence to lead one of the first mass boycotts of segregated public transportation in Philadelphia, leading to a law that permitted integrated streetcars in 1867. Even more impressive is the fact that in 1874, Robert Smalls was elected state representative in South Carolina for 2 terms, and he was later elected for 3 more terms in 1881 to 1887. His election as a representative in the Reconstruction South was a frontier for the African American community, since he was one of the first freed men to enter politics. As a legislator, Smalls fought against the disenfranchisement of black voters across the South, while many white legislators tried to use Jim Crow laws to create a frontier or barrier to suffrage and equal rights for African Americans. Smalls' achievements also included becoming the first black man to be promoted to captain in the United States Navy, although he was never a commissioned officer. In 1897, by an act of Congress, Smalls was granted a pension equal to that of a Navy captain. Many historians agree that the actions of Robert Smalls helped establish a solid foundation for the civil rights of following generations of African Americans.
But then most people, though, will say that it started in 1954 with the Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycott. Well, the long civil rights movement, though, actually does go back to people like Robert Smalls, who indeed were trying to pass and propose legislation that would give African Americans equal opportunity to work, equal opportunity in public accommodations, as you've heard, equal access to the ballot, and basically dignity. And Smalls' own life sort of sets the tone for that, in that he was a fighter. He challenged discrimination every opportunity and every chance that he got.
The story of Robert Smalls is an inspiration to all people who feel that there are frontiers in their lives that may be impossible to break through or find equality. Robert Smalls said, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life."